This is a Q Media production.
Welcome to Leading Change. Today on the podcast, we're diving into the most important elements of driving organisational change with my guest, Fadi Zeitoune. As organisations navigate complex transformations, it's essential to understand how purpose, governance, and effective design play a role in achieving long-term success. In this episode, we'll explore how to set your organisation up for success by creating a clear vision, defining your structure, and tackling common pitfalls that can derail change efforts. From real-world examples in healthcare and marketing, we'll discuss how to align stakeholders and implement governance strategies that fuel growth and resilience. Change is not just about overcoming obstacles. It's about shaping a future-focused organization that thrives in times of transition. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Fadi. Nice to have you on.
Thank you. It's good to be on.
Now, Fadi, I have heard you say before that change has become a commodity. Can you tell me a little bit about that and why you think so?
When change as a discipline was first introduced into large programs and projects, it was a gap in the capability that projects needed to deliver successfully. And so over time, though, as we created the methodologies and the disciplines and the communities of practice, et cetera, around change management, the meaning behind why we needed change management seems to have been lost. And we've become more enamored with the form that it takes, the spreadsheets at 1,000 paces, the systems that you use, the process that you run, rather than the purpose by which we need change, good change management in organisations. What's compounded that is that, again, when it was first introduced, change management was a stream of work within a project. And that was okay at the time. Most organisations may have been running, one large ERP or something like that, and projects weren't coming thick and fast like they are today. So right now, if you look at any large, complex organisation, even smaller ones, the change is constant. And the tools and the discipline that we developed, where you have this change manager as a role within a project, can oftentimes compound the problem rather than contribute to a solution. So if you're, the average punter within the organisation trying to do your job, and you're being confronted by this change and that change, whether it's professionally driven or personally driven, you're going to need to navigate all of those various changes. And we haven't adjusted as a discipline to help them navigate those various changes that are occurring all at the same time.
So it sounds like the leader really does need to lead change, the person who is in there, who's going to catch it on the other side.
Yep.
So how do they find those skills?
We've come up with this concept where what we call stakeholder-centric change, which is rather than look at change as something that you do from the project out, you take it from the stakeholder's perspective in. So playing, if you like, a flight traffic control function so that you develop the relationships, you develop the channels, you develop the tone of voice and the understanding of the cohort that you're helping to navigate the change with. And the projects plug into those existing channels, that existing framework that you've established. It should be an enduring capability that all organisations undertaking transformation should invest in. What then happens is what happens to the change manager that's sitting on a project? Well, I think that job needs to be fundamentally reshaped. And if you take it back to what does a project need to be successful, they don't necessarily need a business analyst, a change manager, or testing manager, or whatever. I think you can actually make those roles a lot more fluid. So the change manager trading upstream a little bit. So rather than getting involved once the solution's been designed to conduct an impact assessment or whatever, why not build on those capabilities and get involved in the design, create the solution, so that once you've helped to shape the solution, you understand what the impacts are going to be, and you know what needs to be conveyed to the audience to make the solution successful.
I love the idea of looking at it from a central viewpoint and actually starting with what's our purpose, taking that purpose-led approach. So, my guess is you go into organizations and you have a bunch of leaders that are with different priorities. How do you get them aligned up front? What are some of the tools or techniques that you use to really get them to understand this is what we're trying to achieve?
As a consultant, I see my role not to, solve problems for my clients or, be the smartest person in the room or anything like that. It's to give them the tools, the templates, the language to solve the problems themselves, to coach them through it. So one of the tools that we use, you could use many others, but we like to look at organizations at the kind of the top level as a process. And we use a tool we call the value chain to articulate what that is. So, what's your purpose, and how do you break down each part of that into the value drivers that deliver that purpose? In what order do they need to occur? How important are they to your business, etc. So, if you think of it at that top level, it looks like a process because it is.
Can you give us an example of a client you've worked with and what their value chain looks like?
Yeah. So, look, most clients, in most industries, the value chain will be pretty similar. The differences will be in the relative priority they place in the value drivers. That's what drives their competitive advantage, or the order in which they see those value drivers needing to occur in order to deliver successfully. So, a typical, let's say, a retailer, it's everything from coming up with a go-to-market strategy, developing or buying or purchasing the products that are going to be appealing to your customers, marketing them effectively, taking them to store or selling them online, and then supporting customers in their use of those things. So, think of it as if you're sitting around the table talking to your partner who doesn't work in a corporate environment, if you were to explain to them what are the 5 or 6 things that your business does to be successful, what would they be? How would you measure them? How would you know whether you're being successful? So, it's really in plain terms trying to articulate the value that your organization delivers and how it lines up to deliver its purpose.
So I'm an executive. I now understand my business. I've put it down in a value chain. I understand the inputs, the outputs, the measures. But there's a problem in my business. And let's just say, for example, we want to use our customer data so that we can market more effectively, right? Project. So from your perspective, you're saying that we need to do that centrally rather than just picking up a brand new project. How do you approach that with the executive team?
Yeah, so that's a great example because what's the problem you're trying to solve? What would help them to understand? Firstly, is to get visibility to that being the problem. Most people in organisations, they look at their organisation not as a process. They look at it as the teams that exist within the project, within the organisation. So, we've got a sales team, we've got a marketing team, we've got a customer service team, etc. So we disaggregate the organisation immediately. And so we make something like that marketing's problem. Now, the issue with that is you don't recognise that an organisation is an organism, right? It's a system. The fact that we've got a marketing team, a customer service team, or a sales team is just an administrative convenience to deliver those things. That's how we've chosen to structure ourselves to deliver that value. So in that example, the customer data, is that a problem that exists just for marketing? No. That's a problem that manifests across the organization. So by looking at the value chain, you understand where does that problem manifest, but does it have its root cause somewhere else? Is there something that we're doing upstream in the value chain that is contributing to our inability to do that really well? And so you start looking across the system and identifying what are the various changes that you need to make in order to solve the problem at its root cause. But also you help to understand, firstly, who's responsible for that outcome within the organization, but who across the organization needs to be involved in order to solve it. So in that instance, there's a technology part that needs to be solved for. There's a customer service element. There might even be a product development issue that needs to be addressed. That all needs to come together to solve that issue. It's not simply, a customer data or a marketing problem.
So it's interesting because it actually reflects back to the role of that old change manager who used to have to create a stakeholder list of all the different people and what they're impacted and how they're impacted. And to me, looking at it as a value chain, the actual impacts and the people, it actually sounds like it just drops right out.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I like about using a value chain, particularly with organisations that have a fairly deep relationship with an external audience, not-for-profits, service delivery organisations, etc. You're able to link the internal outcomes and measures to the expectations and outcomes that your external audience is looking at from you. So, I think about working for a health organisation and looking at their value drivers. One of them being their referral networks. So, working with the client and trying to understand, well, what's a good outcome as it relates to the referral networks that bring patients to the hospital. And if you look at it traditionally, it's really about how do we process them quickly, how do we find them and get them into the system as quickly and efficiently as possible. But when you take an external lens on that and you look at, well, what's your customer or patient's expectation? It's actually about not going to hospital at all. It's actually about being treated effectively where is most appropriate for you at that time in your health journey. So when you look at it like that, the outcome isn't about how quickly can we get them into hospital. It's actually how do we get them to avoid hospital. What are the other referral pathways that we can send them to? So getting them treated at home, getting them treated by a GP or by another health professional, rather than bringing them into the public health network.
So let's assume that hospital/health example, and we decide that there's time that we need to actually roll out some changes to that. Now, when we're talking about an organization where we have so many different types of stakeholders and we need to get them on board. So, for example, we're talking to nurses or to doctors or to hospital administrators, and yet we're sitting in this ivory tower office talking about value chains.
Yeah.
So how do we change that communication, translate that into a message that somebody on the front line is actually going to understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the first thing, the most powerful thing about looking at the organization, whether you use a value chain or something else, a service catalog, whatever it might be, it's about starting with the work first. The organization, it's not there to, it doesn't exist as an organism independent of the process that it's there to deliver. So the first thing is to get people to understand what is it that we're there to do, what's our purpose, and what's the work involved in delivering that purpose, rather than looking at themselves as sitting in a certain department, a certain business unit or whatnot. So that's the first thing, is getting everyone looking at the same thing and recognizing, yep, that's what we do. That's where I sit in that. Now, from a cultural change perspective, what we found can be quite helpful is to kind of come up with that superordinate view. So what's that perspective that everyone can get behind? So in a health example, it's the patient, right? Everyone's there, regardless of what your role is, whether you're there as a hospital administrator, a surgeon, ED, doctor or nurse, you're there to deliver good patient outcomes. So if we could map the patient journey against that value chain and get people to see, well, yep, that's why we're here, and that's how the work breaks down to deliver a better patient outcome, that gives them that kind of overarching, uniting view behind something that we can rally behind.
If we want to change this language, and it really is a culture change at that stage, because if we're trying to get, say, a nurse to really understand the purpose when, they think at the moment they come into work to do their job, clock in, clock out, to help the patient, but don't see that bigger picture, and yet we want them to understand the language and the whole entire chain, that is a big change for them to get their head around.
Yep.
How can we do that really well, like really hands-on example on that?
So the first thing is to not look at ourselves as you mentioned an ivory tower. So you've got to meet your stakeholder where they're at. So what we've done in lots of cases, whether it's retail employees in supermarkets and retail stores, or in the example that you've provided, health workers in a public health network, is to bring them into the conversation, but make the conversation something that's going to resonate with them. So the example that I've provided is we would never show them like a value chain with, outcomes and measures, but we might show them a patient journey that approximates that value chain. So use language that's going to help kind of bring that to life for them. Get them walking the walls, get them contributing to what they want to see changing in that journey. That's typically how we would address it. And the reason why I think that can work is, again, it comes back to what is the work, rather than starting with what's your role or what team do you belong to and how do you relate to other teams. It's actually coming back to what's the purpose of this organization and how do we deliver that purpose? What's the work that we need to get done to do that? And I think that's something that everyone within an organization can connect with.
Do you want your team to achieve peak performance? Well, then it's time for a change. Welcome to Leading Edge. We're not about traditional training. We're about transformation. Our outcomes-based leadership development programs focus on real results through behavior change and mindset shifts. We customize programs tailored to your team's needs, packed with cutting-edge content based on neuroscience and positive psychology. We run engaging workshops, personalized coaching sessions, and practical exercises to ensure an enriching experience for your team. How does it work? We dive deep. We start with surveys to identify strengths and gaps, which helps us to design a bespoke program designed for your team's success. With our approach, progress is inevitable. Our expertly facilitated workshops and coaching sessions ensure growth, and the results speak for themselves. Are you ready to take the leap? It's simple. First, choose your program. We have 5 to choose from, or you can customize a program to suit your team's needs. Second, pick your duration. We deliver 3, 6, or 12-month programs. This way, we can reinforce the learnings over time to drive real change. And finally, plan with us. Each team is different, so we make sure that what we're delivering is exactly what you need. Let's unlock your team's potential together. Contact us today, and let's start this journey to transform your team to achieve greatness. When we're looking at an organization that does that well, that really understands that if we're trying to drive change, we have to understand what we do and why we do it. What are the characteristics of that organization? What does the leadership look like? What does the culture look like? Are there certain common threads that an organization that is really going to succeed in this has?
Yeah, good question. I think firstly, it always starts with leadership, and a leadership team that understands what are the value drivers, how do we deliver them, what's our relative role and responsibility as an executive team across that value chain. That's the first and foremost thing. I can't tell you how many times we've worked with organizations where the fundamental question of what's your purpose and how do you deliver it isn't commonly understood at the board level, at the executive level. They immediately disaggregate their understanding of their organization to the various business units that exist. So you ask them, what is it that you do as an organization? And their answer immediately turns to, well, we have a marketing team, we have a sales team, we have this product development team, etc. So an organization that can elevate beyond that understands that the organization exists to deliver that purpose is fundamental. The other one is it's boring, but it's just discipline. An organization that can run a process. It's surprising how most organizations aren't particularly good at either A, running a process with some level of discipline, or B, managing relationships across the organization to get it done. So organizations that tend to do it well, and not always and not entirely, they'll be your large grocery retailers, for example, because ultimately everything needs to hit a store. So how do you line up behind the store to make sure that the process runs effectively so that shoppers have what they need every day in order to fill a basket? So those sorts of disciplines that need to exist need to be paired with, at a higher level, that overarching view of what the organization's there to deliver and how you go about delivering it.
So we now know how to start the program. We've aligned. We understand how to roll it out. I want to hit back on what you said at the beginning, because Now that it sounds like we don't need change management as a role, we've clearly
Yeah.
defined that it really is about business owners driving this
Yeah.
through. So if we're going to now set up a project in this new world, what does that look like? Do we still have a transformation office? Do we still have a PMO? What types of roles and if what are the capabilities that are needed to actually, because we still need governance to actually roll these out, but how should we be doing it differently?
Yeah. Look, I think it comes down to three things. The first is to rethink how you organize your programs. So again, we jump straight to what are the projects we need to deliver, and which executive is going to sponsor which project, and away we go. That's the typical PMO transformation office approach that we have today. And so you come up with a laundry list of projects and you disaggregate that within the organization. So the interdependencies that exist within those projects, et cetera, get lost almost immediately. So the first part of that will be aligning that to the outcomes that you need to deliver. Now, I'm biased. I'd say, well, the value chain's a great tool to be able to achieve that. But if you say, look, we do these 5 things and we've got problems across that value chain, the order in which you need to deliver those things, make improvements, make investments as an organization to truly transform, can be informed by your understanding of, if something upstream is broken, you should tackle that first because it's going to have an outsized impact on the rest of the value chain. So firstly, using that as an organizing framework so that you can link it not just to the value drivers, but also to the outcomes that you want to deliver. So working with a client recently where we tried to push them in that direction quite heavily and let's say not entirely successfully to say, well, you're not doing these projects to deliver a new tool. You're actually delivering the project in order to enable a different client outcome. And to enable that different client outcome has all of these things that you need to do in parallel or in a certain order in order to achieve that outcome. Unfortunately, we didn't win that argument. They wanted to kind of persist with, okay, no. We want to have project streams aligned to the big investments that we're making. So that's the first thing is getting clear on recognizing your to value drivers or outcomes. The second is creating a more fluid capability within your project, project office, whatever you want to call it, so that do we need business analysts? Do we need change managers? Do we need project managers? Those are roles. We need project management. We need business analysis. We need change management. But can they occupy different roles? Can we configure them differently? Can that skill set be a little bit more fluid? So we like to think of it as more of a broad-based transformation advisory type of skill set rather than a discrete set of roles that just do business analysis, just do change management, etc. So if you can get someone who understands how to design a solution, solve problems, manage a work stream, understand change impacts, etc., why not? Why wouldn't you create a more fluid structure so that you can flow people to work and use them more effectively? The third component is the one that I spoke to previously, which is around creating that air traffic control capability, the stakeholder-centric change management. So the channels, the relationship, the ways of communicating and engaging with the different segments in your workforce so that you can connect the dots between the various projects and present a really coherent narrative to your audience so that they understand what's changing, how it's changing, and all of the things that are happening connect to one another.
We've talked a lot actually about roles and functions. And through what I've been hearing, it actually sounds like most businesses are not functioning the way they should. They're maybe not structured the way that is most effectively. And even if they are structured that way, perhaps they're not using their resources in the most effective way because we do hear that organizations are quite bloated and we lose people and we're still effective. And so to me, that says, I don't know that we're doing this right. So let's spend some time on org structure. How would you start if you're working with an organization to assess whether an org structure is the correct one?
Yeah, great question. And I spend a lot of my time in my days having this type of conversation with clients. So fundamentally, when you look at org design as a discipline, people's minds immediately turn to structure. So if we were looking at it as a set of questions, the first thing that people will turn to is, what roles, what teams, what am I going to call them, etc. And I understand that because that's the most important thing at an individual level. What's my title? Who's my team? Who's my boss? That's the most important thing. Where organizations go wrong is structure is just one lever that you can pull to affect a more effective organization. In fact, it's the last thing that you should be looking into when trying to be a more effective or efficient organization. When we talk about it, there's three key questions that we like to work through. The first is around design principles. What type of organization do you want to be? So if you think about it as, if you're building a house and you're the architect, if the homeowners can't agree on what type of house they want, your ability to design, let alone build something, is going to be compromised. So getting leaders together to kind of answer that question fairly prescriptively, what is it that you need to be? It's not going to be about, well, we need a sales team, we need a marketing team, we need that. It's going to be things like we need to be more customer focused, we need to be more agile, we need to be more fluid, those sorts of things. So that you can start working with. So that's the first question. What type of organization do you want to be? The second is, how do you want to operate? So that's an operating model question. So again, we're not touching structure. So it's, what is it that you do as an organization? Again, you could articulate that with a value chain or something else. But it's basically, what are the things that the organization needs to get done to deliver its purpose? Let's start with the work first. Then you start looking at, well, if that's what we need to do, who should do it, and how should that organization operate effectively? They're the primary operating model questions that you need to answer. And I can tell you through experience, 80-90% of the problems that an organization's facing can be solved with a better articulation of that, crisper ways of working, rather than starting to tinker with spans and layers and number of resources. So that's really where you start driving an effective organization. When you start looking at structure, it's about efficiency. It's, do we need as many warm bodies as we've got to deliver that operating model? What do we call them? How many managers do we need? How many reports do those managers need? Those are all efficiency questions. And so if your problem is, actually, our operating model's fantastic, we're delivering everything that we need to do, we just need to do it with less people, then yeah, by all means, knock yourself out, start looking at the structure. But oftentimes organizations jump straight to structure, they tinker with that, and then they wonder why they're not more effective. The reality is that organizations are a process. They require, human beings to deliver parts of that process. But increasingly, and since the Industrial Revolution, machines and other technologies have taken over more of what people do. So we still, however, look at organizations primarily as a collection of teams populated by roles, and start from that perspective and try and solve the problem in that way.
So if we go the other way, and now we're looking at what we do and what we deliver, and then we look at that operating model view. So maybe give me some examples of that operating model piece of work. So if I'm an executive or leader and I realize actually maybe we should start here, what are the things we need to look at to understand where the issues are and the kind of criteria that go into redesigning an operating model?
Yeah, so you've got your statement of what the work is. Now, if you're using a value chain, great. If you're not, knock yourself out. Service catalog, whatever it is that you do, ask the question, well, if you're in the CEO's shoes, who do you turn to understand who's responsible for each of the value drivers? Okay. Drives me to distraction, but clients will say, well, everybody's responsible for sales. Yeah, sure. If everybody's responsible, then nobody's responsible, right? So if you're in the CEO's shoes, if the sales numbers are down, who do you turn to understand, well, what are we doing about that? If the marketing outcomes aren't being delivered, who do you turn to? So that's the first thing, is to say, right? Are we clear on who's got the handle on the lever when it comes to the major value drivers within an organization? And if you can't answer that question, there's a gap. If the answer is pretty clouded, that it's actually a couple of people or it's a bit complicated, that's actually where not only is that ineffective, but no doubt you're going to find inefficiencies there. Because if you've got a couple of functions that are each playing in that space, then by all means, you're going to have duplicate roles, you're going to have duplicate effort, et cetera, that exists there. So that's the first question that
So
you
an
want to ask.
example of that might be marketing, which we hear
Yeah.
about all the time. We have a
Sure.
central marketing department, but then each individual business unit might have their own product marketing team.
Yep.
So this to me sounds like duplication.
Yep.
Why would an organization want to have it one way or the other?
Great question. I think it's a mix of poor process and human nature. But I'll start with the human nature. And that is, if I'm on the hook to deliver something, I want to make sure that I'm in total control of all of the levers that I need to deliver that. So if I need to rely on somebody sitting over there to help do something, to deliver an outcome that's important to me, I'd rather that person report directly to me. So part of that is that it's human nature and it's compounded in organizations where culture is probably not that strong. So I think that's probably fundamentally where it comes from. It's that insecurity, that lack of trust that might occur. The second is then process. So if I don't have a really effective way of managing the interdependencies that exists within every organization, then it's going to compound the distrust that already exists because you've got no system to rely on to help you replicate the types of ways of working that need to occur to be successful. So I'm looking after marketing or I'm looking after sales or whatever it is. Now, will I go to the central marketing team and depend on them to participate in a process that's going to deliver an outcome for me? Well, if the ways of working that exist are effective, sure. If they don't, no way.
Right. So we've got to get that set up before we can start centralizing our functions.
Absolutely. And we talk to clients about giving them the type of frameworks and language to solve that problem. So we talk about the nature of dependencies within organizations. So we use like a framework like RACI, for example. Everyone might have used that previously. I probably bang on about this too much with clients, but using those terms really prescriptively. What does it mean to be accountable? What does it mean to be responsible? What does a C and an I, what does consulted and informed really mean within an organization? It's not an engagement exercise. It's not about being nice. It's about understanding the dependencies that exist within the organization and then wrapping around those dependencies the right interactions so that you can rely on people, that the system of work is effective. We go straight to, you're going to be the marketing manager, I'm going to be the sales manager. And we think we've defined the boundaries of our responsibility, but we've invested no time in understanding how is marketing going to work with sales so that marketing gets what it needs to be successful and the sales function gets what it needs from marketing to be successful. That type of interaction, the type of governance that we wrap around that relationship, it atrophies within an organization. It's barely designed in a good org design process because we jump straight to structure.
Do you feel that relationship, sales and marketing, which is so common in organizations, do you think that's because of personalities? Or do you think it's because of the way the organization has been designed, or perhaps it's the culture that's being pushed through?
I'd like to think it's not personality because it's something that just seems to persist in organizations time and time again. Lovely people with the best intentions. It just seems to be that it doesn't work, regardless of which organization. The other one is, product development or customer service. I mean, the number of times that I've worked with organizations where it's a recurring theme that, the customer service team is the last one to hear about a new product rollout or a new sales campaign or whatever. Why? Why is that? And I think it's because it's a mixture of structure and the behaviors that drives, because we think of ourselves not as one organization there to deliver a singular purpose. We think of ourselves in the organizational units that currently exist. So we all automatically create these silos in our minds. So that drives a behavior that I'm sales, you're customer service, or you're marketing. and we do our jobs, we stick to our knitting, and that's the way things need to be. And I think it's compounded by the fact that we don't have really good ways to interact as organizations. We create meetings, for everything, but most of the time, 80% of the people in the meeting say nothing, keep their camera off if it's on Zoom, and they're there because it's an engagement exercise to say we invited them, but we didn't actually understand what's the purpose of the meeting that we're running and who actually is a dependency to deliver that outcome. Is a meeting the appropriate mechanism to deliver that outcome? Is it something else? Could it be an email? Could it be, some type of other engagement activity? So we're not very good at defining how an organization should operate. And I blame that on, poor org design.
I think most people will agree about meetings in too many of them. And look, and I agree. I feel like organizations need rules, regulations. I've been in companies that have rules sitting on the wall for each meeting. I think it gets to the point where people kind of stop seeing that.
Yeah.
But I agree. Putting rules in place is absolutely most
Yeah.
valuable.
Those rules about, you need to have an agenda, can't run for more than 45 minutes, all those things are great. But the fundamental question of purpose, do you actually need the meeting in the first place? And who should be the composition of the participants in the meeting? That's a question you answer before you get into the room and read those rules, right? So it's org design isn't about structure. It's 1/3 of the question at best, and it only answers a very small number of questions that you might have as an executive.
I was working with a client the other day who said she actually did that exact same piece after we chatted about her team meeting and the value of it. And she actually had to send some stakeholders away. And, I think at first she felt bad about it because she felt, oh gosh, we're not including them. Whereas the stakeholders were quite happy to get that hour back in their day.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
Everyone's got those clients who, they spend 8 hours of their day in meetings and they do their work at night or, off the corner of their desk. We do spend altogether too much time in corporate meetings.
We've spoken about the organizational structure now. Let's assume we've got our operating model right. We've got our structure right. One question that often comes up is, do I have the right number of people in my team? And, if we look at the news recently, over the last couple of years, we've had biggest tech companies in the world get rid of 20, 30% of their workforce. Same thing with banks locally, telcos. It's been pretty horrific. And we kind of wonder, well, gosh, if they get rid of all these people, how are they still up and running? And you think, well, actually, maybe that's because they had too many to begin with. So how do we know what is the optimal number of people for our team?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it all comes back to what's the work that you need to deliver and how do you measure the outcome associated with that work. It becomes a question of, well, if that's how much work I need to deliver, and I make some assumptions around productivity, the answer should be derived from that. Sales is a great example where, they've got a relatively good science around it because it's a very metrics-driven function. So I know if I need to do a certain number of sales, and I can assume an average or successful salesperson will do X. Well, then I need this many salespeople. It's not a very different equation for other parts of the organization. And I know some people will say, well, no, it's too hard to measure what we do. If you can't measure it, well, do you really need it? Okay, so a lot of the work that exists within organizations, you've got to ask yourself whether or not your organization actually needs that. So I think large part of what's driving the consolidation that we're seeing, the redundancies that we're seeing, is a question around the value of work. And so why we start with a value chain is that's the first and the central question that you should be answering when you design your organization. What's the value? How does that drive your purpose? And then how many people do you need to be able to fulfill that value?
Why do you think organizations have gotten so big and bloated so that they can actually get to the point where they do get rid of 30% of their workforce? I mean, there must be something that's happening in there that allows them to grow and get budget to hire more people and deliver more stuff.
Yeah.
and yet it's not needed. So why do we think that that's happening?
I think there wouldn't be one core reason. I think it's a confluence of lots of different things. The first is just poor org design. Is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the organization's there to do, what it's there to deliver, and how many people you need to do that successfully. So, we tack on lots of different teams and roles when we're purely looking at our organization as a structure. Okay. So that's going to proliferate lots of different roles. So I think that's the first part of it. Second part of it is just human nature. So you have a certain number of managers, they need a certain number of direct reports, they need a certain number of resources. So I think part of it is, just the bloating that comes with growing as an organization and promoting people and hiring people at a senior level. It creates its own sort of cottage industry of people. And I think the last element is that as we don't have the systems of work to drive an effective organization in most cases, so we need people almost to run the organization rather than work within the organization. So the proliferation of enabling functions so that the organization talks to each other or that the systems of work can be maintained. We've got some clients who have systems that require, multiple systems administrators, and you need people who run processes for the organization that bring people together, coaches and all that sort of stuff. That's stuff that doesn't directly speak to purpose, but it's there to try and help an organization work better together. To me, that's where a lot of the fat within an organization exists.
There's a lot of talk within businesses when they decide whether they offshore or use consultants or, do work internally. And I think a lot of companies kind of question, what am I supposed to be doing? What is my core business? What should I be outsourcing? Should I outsource any of it? How do I cost it? There's a lot of moving pieces in that. Is there sort of one way that you recommend to clients? Are there different options that you might tell them to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's one that for a couple of decades now has been more prominent as offshoring became more of an important element of a service delivery model, particularly in things like HR and finance, etc. And then systems enabled that even more so more recently. So typically we would work with a client to develop something like a decision tree. It doesn't look like a tree, actually. I don't know why we call them that. It looks more like a fishbone, but it's about setting up the questions that you want to ask and in what order in order to arrive at an answer that helps you make those decisions well. The first question is centrally around the value of the work, right? If it's core business, if it's a competitive advantage, that's typically, if not the first question, one of the first two. Then there's a bunch of questions that you would layer on. And it won't be the same set of questions for clients, but ask yourself, well, what are the things that are important in making this decision? So things like, how often do you need that capability? How proximate does it need to be to the front line? Is it a competitive advantage? Is it something that you can procure from the market that is cheaper than what you can do yourself? All of those questions should come up in your mind. And then you kind of ask yourself, well, in the hierarchy of those questions, what's more important? So you will start with the questions of value. You then move to questions of cost. And then you might look at a bunch of questions around the practicalities. So the service delivery, the proximity, etc. Typically, there's 5 or 6 questions that you'd come up with, and they would help you kind of flow to an answer. So typically, the things that drive value that are competitive advantage, they're things that you want to retain internally. Things that others can do better than you can, they're the things that you want to outsource. And things that don't need to be proximate are the things that you can potentially offshore.
And one final question. If somebody is about to embark on a change in their organization, what is your number one piece of advice to give them?
Wow. Okay, so it's probably the advice that underpins how Levant operates, which is start with an outcome first. So what is the outcome that you're trying to deliver? Who's your audience, and put yourself in their shoes. And with those two things, how are you going to tell a good story?
Fantastic. It has been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. It's been fantastic.
How can our listeners contact you?
You can either go to levantconsulting.com.au or directly email at fadi@levantconsulting.com.au.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe. Taking just 2 minutes to leave a review on Apple Podcasts would mean the world. Your reviews play a vital role in expanding the reach of this podcast and making a bigger impact.